Many tutorials show you how to build a rack system, but most of the time, these systems aren't the ones you want to bring into production. In this video, I want to show you the difference between a simple rack architecture and the kind of architecture you will have or you will need to build when you want to bring your rack to the next level. So I will first show you how a simple rack system looks like, and I will give you all the components that independently picked can make a rack system really robust and good for a production system. So let's get started. So as you can see here, we have a pretty basic rack system. This is the rack system you will see from many tutorials. Pretty simple. You have a UI. The UI is communicating with the backend. The backend probably is Python or Node.js. We have a vector store, a pretty simple vector store with few documents, and you have an LLM. So what you do here is that the user asks for something. It goes to the Python code. The Python code tries to find similar documents from the vector store and embed this document into the system prompt or the query and send it back to the LLM. The LLM will generate a response and you send it back to the user. So this system is okay when you want to work with 2-3 documents, but when you have to deal with terabytes of data, this will fall apart quite quickly. When you want to consider security, cost, speed, and a lot of other things, you will have to add a bit more layer into this architecture to make it robust enough for production system. So down here, I have a pretty simplistic view of a system that can be considered good enough to go into production. You have security considerations, you have a bit more modules when it comes to context construction. You have a model catalog when you want to choose between simple model for simple use case and smarter model for complex use cases. And I will be breaking this down a bit more. So the goal here is not to give you everything. It's just to give you an idea of what a production system may look like. And by the way, I will put the link in the description for a really good article talking about this specifically in case you want to learn a bit more about this system. So let's first start with this, okay? So you will first start with the UI, same as before. You don't really have to touch on the UI here. The UI will send the response to our system. But instead of just getting the code to fetch some data from the vector store, we have a complex context construction system here. The context constructions is quite important because, as you can see it here, the context is what makes your answer good or not. So you have to make it right. This context can just actually pull data from any source, which can be a vector store, a web search, a database, or just the cache of your conversation. So you have a bit more control over what you're passing to the model, and you can actually extend it to support different systems. The next component here is the guardrails. The guardrails are important when you want to make sure that the personal identifiable information from your data is not passed to an external system like an LLM provider. In this case, for example, we don't want our, let's say, secret keys to be sent to an LLM. We don't want our secret customer names or our secret internal policies to be sent to an LLM. So we need a guardrail to actually remove this from the data you're sending to the model and replace it later in the final response. I will show you how it looks like a bit later. So the last one here is the model catalog. Just in case you want to deal or you want to switch in between different models, you want to track your costs, you want to log your LLM calls, you want to manage tokens and keys efficiently, you will need a model catalog for that. So let's go through these systems a bit more in depth here. This is what our context construction system looks like. We have our Python code, which can be one service or different services, which are actually communicating with a bunch of external systems. In this case, we have not just one vector store. We can have multiple vector stores. We can have, let's say, one vector store per department, one vector store per company, but depending on what you're trying to build here, because you are dealing with a lot of data. Most of the time, you may have just multiple instances of one single vector store or multiple vector stores. You can actually handle it here. You also have call to external systems like web search, external APIs, databases, and you can also have a cache. The cache here will just serve for you to manage your context window. So if you exceed the context window, you can go into your cache of past conversations or past messages, compress it, and pass it back to the system. This is also part of context construction. You need to take that into account. It can just be right away something that's quite similar. So if two users ask really similar questions, you can directly right away get the answer from your cache and give it back to the user. This is a bit tricky. Some of the subject we'll talk about in upcoming videos, so don't forget to subscribe. But the end goal of all this is just to populate your context here. Okay. When you have the context populated, the next step is security. You have to make sure that all the informations that you don't want to send to the model are actually stripped out of the context that you're sending to the model. You have now this guardrail for personal identifiable information, that you need to implement. And this is quite important. Why? Because all of these keys, you don't know how the provider is managing them. You don't know what they're doing with them. They're actually saving this. And it can be just, internal information that you don't want to leak. So you need to replace them with placeholder most of the time. So in this case, for example, we have the company secret client is, instead of just right away giving the name of the company client to the LLM, we need to replace it with the placeholder. And we'll come back to how to handle this placeholder a bit later. It can also just be removing completely any context that you don't want to send to an LLM, right? So this system is actually here for that, to make sure that you're not sending the information you don't want to send to the LLM. The next part here is your LLM catalog. The LLM catalog goal is to have a bunch of, to give you access to a variety of LLMs. So you can actually call the right one for your right use case. We have routing here for that sole purpose. So if you have a pretty simple task or pretty simple thing that a simple model can answer, you can use this simple model and optimize for cost and latency in that case. But if you have a use case that is a bit more complex to handle, you can pass it to a more complex LLM. And in this same model catalog, you can actually manage your secrets and tokens and other things. So after your response have gone through the guardrails and the LLM catalog, you have an answer from your LLM. The next step here is to come back to your guardrails for the second time. But this time it's for a different purpose. Here you need to first replace back all the information you deleted earlier. So the company secret that you replace with the placeholder, you can replace it back here to make sure that your whole response is not full with placeholders, but will read information. The second thing is to check and make sure that the answer that you're giving to the user is aligned with your company policy. You want to avoid use cases where LLM is giving free flight to users because they just ask for it, right? You want to make sure that when the LLM answer, it's actually aligned with what you want the model to do, and you can verify it here. For example, you can just block your model from answering random questions and make sure it's focused on what you actually want the model to do. And the last part, which is quite optional here, is to make sure that your structure output are correct. So you can actually pass that here as well and make sure that the output that is given by the model is actually correct. And then finally, you have your output that you can show to the user. You can also cache this response for next use, for the use in the next time. So you can just write it to your cache so that your Python code here can right away get it back when we have a pretty similar question, or just use it later for other use cases. So this may look like a simple system, but it's quite good. You can actually extend it and add a bit more layer, but you have the foundation to build a system that's a bit secure and have a bit more components. And here, this is quite a simplistic view of the context construction system, of the context construction part. You may extend this to a bit more complex, to a more complex architecture where you have maybe microservices and things that are a bit more scalable. So, but overall, this is how you can actually bring a simple rack system into a more complex rack system. So when you're building your next portfolio project, don't forget to reference this video and try to build something that's quite closely relate to what people can view in production systems. So thank you for watching, and as usual, I will put all the link in the description below. If you don't want to miss our next video, which will probably be about how to make your rack smarter with probably most of the advanced rack techniques that you will need, don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching, and see you in the next video. Ciao.